Hi, everyone. So before we begin, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to each person here for joining us. R&D has organized this screening of David Attenborough's A Life on Our Planet and Q&A to share an important and urgent message at a crucial time for our planet. We hope that all of you participants and attendees leave here today feeling inspired to take action. So a little bit of background about R&D. We are a nonprofit that funds scientific research for a sustainable and carbon-free future. Specifically, we focus on providing funding for scientists during the proof of concept phase of technological development, where a gap in traditional research funding limits critical progress in the fight against climate change. So tonight, we'll be watching David Attenborough's A Life on Our Planet, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of question and answer session with our panel of experts, including our very special guest, Dr. Chuck Kutscher. So please, I know you're all on video, but join me in virtually welcoming our panelists. We have three members of the R&D Board of Directors. That's Chloe Castaneda. Hey, Chloe. Brent Nelson, he's waving. Ethan Palais, and of course, Dr. Chuck Kutscher himself. So a little bit about Chuck. He's a fellow at the University of Colorado's Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute and a past chair of the American Solar Energy Society. He previously worked for 40 years as a researcher and manager on a wide range of renewable energy technologies at the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, in Golden, Colorado. He's also focused on climate change solutions for the past 20 years and has given many presentations on the subject. Among his climate change activities are chairing the 2006 National Solar Energy Conference. He's a lecturer in a new online climate change course for environmental journalism, and he's the lead author, most importantly, of both a new report on solutions and a college textbook on sustainable energy. So needless to say, Chuck is definitely an absolute expert when it comes to sustainability and clean climate solutions, and we're super honored to have him tonight. We also have a few special guests in our audience. You're all special, but especially Meredith Preston, who's also on our board of directors. She's there. I don't know if you can see her, but she's probably waving. And also Emily Freed, who's on our advisory board. And we're super happy to have them and also all of you guests here today. So as we watch the film together, I welcome all of you to share questions you have, either in the chat box, or there should be a Q&A box for you all. After the film, our panel will discuss your questions and for about 10 or 15 minutes, just discuss the film as well. And any questions you all might have about R&D as an organization. So thank you all again for joining us. And please, if you haven't already, make sure you're muted, and I'll begin the film. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to shout out Rick Schwerdfager. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but you were also in the audience and you were commenting quite a lot. He's on our our advisory board of directors, so I wanted to thank you for being here and also for adding your commentary. That was really awesome. Just to begin our Q&A session, if our audience has questions throughout this discussion, feel free to just submit more questions into the Q&A chat box. And we'll just get started with the questions we have here. Panelists, feel free to discuss with each other. I'm sure it'll be really interesting for our attendees to hear from your perspectives. So first off, just maybe if you all want to go through and briefly introduce yourselves again in case anyone joined us late, and then maybe just talk a little bit about what struck you about this film. And we'll start with Ethan, our board president.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ethan. I'm the president of the board of directors here at R&D. Also, I have a day job as an operator of renewable energy power plants, solar, wind, and battery storage. Happy to talk with everyone here tonight. Thanks for joining. What struck me most about the film was, I guess, seeing in his life how much biodiversity has been lost, and thinking about what that's going to look like, and having him show us what that's going to look like throughout my lifetime. Quite chilling. As president of a climate change nonprofit, I've talked to a lot of people and asked them directly, how do you feel that climate change has impacted your life? And I think a lot of people still feel like it's something that's happening, but they can't really connect it directly to their life. And I think watching movies like this is a really good way to make it feel like it is impacting your life. As biodiversity decreases, these ecosystems die, and you can't go to visit. As a traveler, it's really just a horrible thing to miss out on. And yeah, I'll pass it off to someone else now.
Chuck, why don't we hear from you?
Okay, I think you wanted us to introduce ourselves again. So yeah, I'm currently with the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute at the University of Colorado Boulder. And before that, I was a researcher and manager for many years at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I retired there a couple of years ago. And I spend most of my time working on climate change related issues. I won't get into all those, but one that's significant, I think, is we published a 120-page report in December on decarbonizing the US, basically focusing on the sectors: electricity, buildings, transportation, and industry. I guess this is the third time I've seen the film. I think it's really a wonderful film. I remember the first time I watched it, I was a little puzzled that he was starting at Chernobyl. And then at the end of the movie, he's back at Chernobyl, and you can see the point he was trying to make, how the fact is that, the Earth has recovered from many mass extinctions, and it will recover from us no matter what we do. And so it really comes down to what kind of a planet do we want for ourselves. And I guess the other thing that really struck me about the film, and this is kind of along the lines of what Ethan was saying, often when I give talks on climate change, I will hear people say, well, the climate naturally changes. It's been hotter, it's been colder, you look at geologic history. And my response to that is, it's only in the last 10,000 years where we've had this incredibly stable temperature and incredibly stable sea level that human civilization and agriculture all developed. Even though our species is 150 to 200,000 years old, Homo sapiens, it's only during that Holocene, that period that was mentioned by David Attenborough, that's what matters. And we're driving ourselves out of that. That was a period where the temperature varied like plus or minus half a degree Celsius. And now we're already increased the temperature over a degree, or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And then furthermore, you look at that 10,000 years, and what do we usually use as a starting point for CO2 in the atmosphere? We say it's 280 parts per million. We're at 415 now. We've increased it by 50%. But as he points out, in 1937, it was 280 parts per million. So we've had this stable temperature for the last 2,000 years. It's only in the last 90 years or so that all these changes have occurred. All this carbon dioxide is built up, the temperature's gone up, the population has exploded. So all of us are living at a time in human history that's dramatically changing the planet, like never before in the thousands of years of human history. So I think he really makes a beautiful point of that, by titling the film "A Life on Our Planet." All this has happened within one human life.
Thanks, Chuck. It's so true. I mean, I feel like that's such a common argument that so many of us have seen before, is that, well, the climate is always changing, or that's just how the planet is. But that's such a good point, that it's really, just changes and changes since humans have been around. All right, let's let's have Chloe just briefly introduce yourself, and then also what struck you about the film.
Hey, yeah, so I'm Chloe. I'm the board secretary for R&D. Up until very recently, I was working as a synthetic chemist for a startup company that's using nanotechnology to enable sort of new renewable energy products and things like that. And then I'm going to be, whatever, switching careers soon. hopefully staying and supporting renewable energy development, technology development. But I think the thing that struck me the most, again, I mean, yeah, like I really do believe that a life on this planet is such an apt name. And it's weird. So I was born in the early 1990s, sort of like when things really, really started to change. And it's so weird to think about like how compact or like how short the period of time was before things really started to change, unfortunately for the worse. But one thing I really liked was that, and I find it tends to be hard to sort of communicate statistics and numbers in a way that makes people emotional or makes people respond and really connected to their life. And what I really liked was that each section there was a pause, and then it was interjected by these numbers of like, you know, how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, how much, I thought the percentage of like the wilderness or you know, wild land was really valuable. And I thought that juxtaposed with all of these images and, you know, explanations of the images was something I hadn't seen before, because usually it's just like, you know, you look at this this image, right? Look at this coral reef that's dying or something like that. But one thing I really appreciated was the presentation of statistics and numbers, so that people could, you know, when they hear those numbers later on, they can be like, oh, that's what that means, right? Like, I thought that was really valuable. So. Oh, you're muted, Emily.
Thanks. Thanks, Chloe. I was just saying that that really ties into what Chuck was just saying to you about how it's this illusion that the climate is always changing or that humans have been around for a long time, but really it's just within really this man's lifetime that there's been such dramatic change. All right, Brent, let's hear from you briefly too.
I'm Brent Nelson. I'm acting science director for R&D, and I have a day job at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. But I'm not wearing that hat. I'm wearing my R&D hat. So I think the thing that struck me about the movie was just that how interconnected things were, right? I mean, I always learned a long time ago studying conservation that, you know, animals needed food, water, shelter, and arrangement. They had to be able to get back and forth between those elements. And just the idea that it's even on a global scale, that the health of the oceans affects the health of the land, right? And that everything's interconnected. And so I think that's the thing that stuck out with me. So thank you.
Thanks, Brent. So I'll move on to our first question, but like I said, all of you are welcome to jump in. I think this is mostly directed at Chuck. So how much renewable energy do we need to deploy every year to meet Biden's goal of a zero carbon electric grid by 2035? And that's from Severin Anderson.
Yeah, it's a lot. And how much, if we want to have a carbon-free grid by 2035, how much we need to deploy is a function of how quickly we electrify things, because it's sort of a dual thing, right? We're trying to make the grid carbon-free and then electrify everything we can to use that carbon-free electricity. So we want to electrify buildings with heat pumps. We want to electrify cars. I personally think we should shoot for 2030 to have all new cars sold in the US being electric vehicles. The state of Washington just passed a law, the legislature, I don't know if the governor signed it yet, but passed a law requiring that in the state of Washington. So how quickly we electrify will determine how fast we need to deploy renewables. So in 2020, we set a record. We deployed 33,000 megawatts combined of solar and wind power. It was a record because there was threat of losing the tax credits. And so there was a real effort to try to get as much out there as possible in 2020. So it was a very successful year in terms of how much was deployed. So basically, what we need to do between now and 2035, over that 14, 50-year time period, we have to deploy somewhere between 2 and 4 times that amount. Again, depending on how fast we electrify buildings and industry. Industry, I think, it's going to take a while to electrify that. I think that's more in line with the 2050 target. Now, one of the things I tell people when I talk about this, and admittedly, that's a lot, but I often show audiences a picture of the Ford Motor Company plant in Michigan, the Willow Run plant that was converted from manufacturing cars to manufacturing bombers. And in 1944, you can see an assembly line of B-24 bombers. This is an assembly line football fields long, and all you see is B-24 bombers disappearing into the distance. They produced a complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the kind of thing the US can do if it treats something like an emergency, the way we treated World War II. And a lot of people are saying, we need to treat climate change the way we treated World War II. It's that serious. And then deploying 2 or 3 times the amount of wind and solar that we did last year, doing that every year, that's certainly within the realm of possibility. It's not like we got to put out 100 times as much. So it's challenging. It's a lot, but it's doable.
Wow. So I guess a follow-up to that is, what about issues with land availability or material supplies and stuff like that?
So, I've seen sometimes on Twitter and social media, people complaining how much land is required for renewables. And I really think that's a misconception. And I know that I'm sure Brent and Ethan can answer this as well. But I would say in the case of onshore wind, wind power integrates very well with farms, right? I mean, you can continue to do agriculture around wind turbines, and farmers love them because it's an extra source of income for them. So they coexist. I've often seen cows following around, moving in the shade of the wind turbine towers during the day. So the cows love them too. Offshore wind is finally taking off in the United States. There's a lot of offshore wind resource. So we have a new first 30 megawatt plant off Rhode Island. Now there's, they're looking at maybe 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind over the next decade or so. When it comes to photovoltaics, NREL has done many, many studies on the potential. So there's huge potential for rooftop solar, which doesn't require any land, right? They've done a study where there's more than enough to provide the whole nation just putting PV on disturbed lands. And then more recently, there have been studies about floating photovoltaics, so they call it photovoltaics. You can put it on reservoirs. It keeps the PV cool and efficient. It reduces evaporative loss from the reservoir. That's a real opportunity. And then finally, just as we integrate wind turbines into farmland, now they're starting to do that with PV, where you actually, it's called agrivoltaics. There's Jack's Solar Garden in Boulder, that's an example of that, where growing crops or having livestock can coexist with PV. So there's huge opportunities, and particularly in the United States, we have great resources for solar and wind. Brent and Ethan, would you like to add to that? You guys are experts.
Yeah, I'll just be real quick, Ethan. You can give a more elaborate answer, but I will say that NREL did a study a number of years ago, just in Colorado, and when you fly over the farmland, you see the little circles, the irrigation circles. Just the unused space between those those little diamonds that are made in between the circles, if we put PV on those unused space on farmland, we would generate more electricity than Colorado uses.
Huh.
And I did a calculation a number of years ago. It's really hard to get the number of how many square meters of roof space we have in the United States, but something about 20% of the roof area in the United States, if it was covered with that type of area, if it was covered with PV, would generate more than the electricity than the United States needed.
Ren,
So-
I hadn't heard that thing about the central pivot irrigation and using PV in the corner. I think that's a brilliant idea. As I recall, an NREL study looked at a potential rooftop and took into account shading and everything, and came up with enough rooftop PV to provide 39% of US electrical needs.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so it's huge.
I'll just jump in to say, as I said earlier, I'm an operator of renewable energy power plants, and the places that we exist are in the middle of really big deserts. There is nothing around. So we might have a 100 megawatt solar farm, like powering thousands and thousands of homes. And it's a drop in the bucket compared to what can exist out there. So as far as land and resource availability, I don't think that's the limiting factor for deploying renewables.
So just to touch on that, Ethan or Chloe, did you want to say something too?
I just really wanted to quickly say, I mean, another thing too, and I mean, this is part of why our org exists, not to, be an advertisement, but like building integrated photovoltaics, things like that. There's, think about like all the sides of buildings that you could use if your windows generated electricity, right? Like, not to plug one specific technology, but there's all this stuff out there that we haven't even thought of just because we only have these form factors that exist right now, right? There's tons of real estate out there that can be tapped into. So.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the point that you all were just talking about, which is that there's a whole bunch of resources, or we have the capacity, as Chuck said earlier, to convert an entire Ford plant into something that creates bombers, more than once an hour. But we also have all these needs and these growing needs for energy. And so if people don't know in the audience, R&D exists to supply funding for those new concepts and those new research areas. But we also have all of these technologies that do already exist that we need to be deploying. So I was wondering if our panelists could talk a little bit about that balance. Obviously, it's not one versus the other, it's all of these things together, but what is the vision, so to speak, of how all of those different areas could be focused on at once?
I can start. So I think, as Chuck said earlier, we're trying to replace our existing coal and gas with renewable energy resources and electrify everything else. There are so many technical problems. So right now, to answer another question that came up, I'm just going to pull up the answer. So electricity is 27% of our carbon emissions. So if we were to replace all of our coal and gas with 100% renewables, that would only get us so far to decarbonizing our economy. So there's a lot of work to do other than just deploying solar and wind. And so in a lot of those, we don't have good answers for yet. For example, how are we going to fly from A to B using sustainable aviation fuel? We don't have an answer for that. And how are we going to manufacture cement, steel, iron, which give off 10% of our global carbon emissions? How are we going to do that sustainably? And we don't have any technical answer for that. So the reason we started R&D was to start answering a lot of those unanswered questions through inventing our way out of this mess. And I think I answered your question, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. I don't know, Chuck or Brent or Chloe, would you?
Well, I think, we have actually doing spirit of the shameless plugs, we have a video, I think it's on our YouTube, might even be on our website, where we talk about everybody needs to do their part, right? We need politicians doing their part. We need local community groups doing their part. We need individuals. And but all of those, everybody, to solve this problem, they need technology, right? And so we need to deploy the existing technologies we have as Chuck described earlier, at an astounding rate and an exponentially increasing rate. And then but then that doesn't finish the race. So I like to think of it as a relay race, right? The first leg of the relay is humans used fire, right? And they burned things. And then we got into burning fossil fuels and that type of thing. And now we're kind of on the leg of wind and solar and some of the existing technologies. And the last leg of the race to decarbonize the economy are things that haven't been invented yet. So we have to do it all. Different people have to do their part. And it's a concerted effort that takes a lot of effort or activity across different parts of the economy and different people doing their thing. I will say that I think that it's one thing to say, well, all we need to do is deploy wind and solar, but as Ethan said, we need other things as well. But about the wind and solar, what's amazing about exponential growth that people don't realize is say you have a 30% exponential growth. That means you go from 0 market penetration to 100% market penetration in about 36 years. But at 18 years, halfway time-wise, you're only at 1% of market penetration. So wind and solar have been growing at these rates for over a decade, and we're at 1% or a little more, right? So the point is, time-wise, we're halfway there. So that's good news. It's just we have to keep that exponential growth going.
Yeah, so again, the idea is to make our electric grid carbon free and then electrify everything we can. There are some things that will be relatively easy to electrify and some things that will be difficult to electrify. Ethan mentioned sustainable aviation fuels. So where we can electrify, we look for carbon-free fuel, okay? There's different options there. I would say I'm getting more and more optimistic that in the long run, green hydrogen will be able to fill that need. And that's hydrogen that you get using solar or wind electricity, running an electrolyzer, splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. That's green hydrogen. It's expensive now, but I think it will come down in price. If you look at the different sectors, one of the things that I think is pretty easy to electrify is vehicles. I have a 4-year-old Chevy Bolt. I can see everybody driving electric cars within the next 10 years because they're so much better than gasoline cars in virtually every way. And in fact, if you look at transportation emissions, 3/4 of those emissions are in light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles. And what we're seeing is battery electric vehicle technology advancing so quickly, so rapidly, that I can see it penetrating the truck market as well, that we don't necessarily need to use hydrogen for that. And then you have shipping. That might be hydrogen stored as ammonia. There actually, Airbus is looking at a hydrogen jet plane. They're doing work on hydrogen planes. There's a lot of interest in storing hydrogen long-term to basically stabilize the grid and back up variable renewables. To do that, we're going to have to use fuel cells or take combustion turbines that are used in natural gas plants and redesign them so they can burn pure hydrogen. So that's another area of research. I might mention that on the industrial side, which is a challenge, there is actually a fossil fuel steel plant in Sweden. And basically what it does is it uses hydrogen in place of coke, basically, to what's called reduce iron ore, to get the oxygen out of iron ore so that pure iron can then be processed in an electric arc furnace. So the idea is ordinarily in a blast furnace, when you produce iron from iron ore, what you do is you combine carbon with the oxygen in the iron ore. That leaves you with pure iron ore and it emits carbon dioxide. Now, when you use green hydrogen, the hydrogen grabs onto the oxygen in the iron ore, okay, and produces water instead of carbon dioxide, and now you're left with the pure iron. So there actually is an operating fossil fuel steel mill now, starting with basic iron ore, that's operating in Sweden. So there's a lot of stuff being developed, and I put a link to our report, which covers that technology and others. So for people interested, it's a free report. It's a PDF. Click on that link and you can download that.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for putting that PDF in there as well. I know we're getting a lot of questions in from different folks in the audience, so I just wanted to, I think maybe we have time for one more, maybe two more. One is, in your opinion, as scientists, what do you wish would be included in more just discussions that general folk are seeing about sustainability, things that are not usually talked about that you see on your end that you wish were talked about?
Brent or Ethan, you want to take that? Or Chloe?
I'll say that I mean, I can echo what I said earlier about, we always feel that solar and wind and electric vehicles are going to be 100% of our solution, when that's pretty far from the reality and why we're here starting this nonprofit. But I would also say that I think that as far as what you can do in the home, there's a lot of really low-hanging fruit that not many people know about or do. For example, we think that the only way to have like clean electricity come into our home is to put solar on your roof. But for a lot of people, that's not an option for them. Maybe they're a renter, or they don't have a house that can support that solar. And there's so many programs out there, third-party companies or your utility yourself, where you can purchase fully 100% renewable electricity. You pay a slight premium, but it's really not much more. So I'm a renter, I'm pretty nomadic. Every year or two, I find myself in a different apartment complex, and I always pay 20% more on my electricity bill just to decarbonize my home, and it feels really good to be able to do that. I think there's small actions like that not many people know about that we could be taking.
I think that for me, it's kind of funny to take that question right after David Attenborough talked about it. But I think that the part of the discussion that is often not talked about is actually population. And Jay Stunkel talked about this in his question. I mean, the problem is the reason nobody wants to talk about population is threefold. I think you have a lot of the world's religions think that having lots of babies is good. So people, that politicians that don't want to offend those religious branches don't want to talk about population. But also, I think that it's something that on the economic side, and that's the question there, is how do we have an economic system that doesn't show economic growth that isn't predicated on population growth? And I think there's a lot of people talking about this for the first time. I mean, Chuck and I have talked about this forever, but I think that really politicians don't want to talk about population growth, because they know, because you get reelected by having a good economy, and all economic models have economy growing by population growth. So I think there's a lot of good economists now that are trying to tackle this issue. I don't think there's any good answers out there yet, but I think they're finally seeing, well, wait a minute, the economic growth is coupled to population growth, and therefore, how can we have a sustainable and healthy and vibrant economy if our population isn't growing? So I think having some answers to that question may help, but it's definitely a topic that tends to be not talked about a lot when you're in kind of sustainability circles. And then the third reason, I think, is just it's like you're talking about people's fundamental right to reproduce, and that's a topic that most people don't like to talk about. But anyhow, that's my answer to that.
I agree with Brent. I just come at it from just a slightly different angle. So you know, population is still growing and we need to do what we can about that. But, you know, the maximum rate of population growth occurred in the 1960s, and it's been decreasing since then. I think many European nations have zero or negative population growth. I think we have pretty low population growth in the US. I can envision us reaching a point where the world achieves zero population growth. Maybe that'll be at 8 billion people, maybe 9 billion people. What I have trouble envisioning, and it's probably because, except for one course in high school, I've never had a course in economics. But all of us it's ingrained in us that you have to have economic growth. And I guess my question is, on a limited planet, even with steady population, can you forever have positive economic growth? And I don't see how that's possible. Maybe an economist can explain it to me, but that really requires, how do we adjust our economy and our whole way of thinking to accept not only zero population growth, but zero economic growth? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to jump in here. So I don't know the answer to that question either. I'm an early career scientist, so I'm definitely not an economist. I never even took stats in school. So yeah, but I think a lot of it is like, how do we reevaluate things so that we're, empowering all populations and not exploiting populations for this unsustainable growth, things like that. And I think it's definitely discussed in certain circles, right? Like, especially if you're involved in, eco-justice or social justice, racial justice circles, a lot of people will talk about alternative economic models, or how we need to sort of uplift everyone and everyone will benefit from it. And, even David Attenborough mentioned this, is like, give everyone universal health care, like give people access to these basic fundamental resources that will help them actually be able to take the opportunity to maybe live a more sustainable path. Like, you think about like food deserts and things like that, like your opportunities to buy close to home, produce that didn't travel across the world or across the country is pretty limited if you don't have the economic resources. So I think something that needs to be discussed, especially in popular or sort of public media, things like that, especially, is the fact that we need to bring everyone up, in addition to, just like figuring out how we're going to deploy renewable energy resources, because everyone needs to be included for it all to get better. So,
Chloe, I think one of the encouraging signs there is it does seem like the Biden administration is putting a lot of emphasis on social equity and social justice issues, as we make this energy transition, as they hopefully pass this infrastructure bill. So there is certainly a lot of attention being paid. Whether enough is being paid is a different question, I guess.
Yeah, and I think one thing now to connect to sort of larger social movements outside of renewable energy is looking at all of these racial justice movements, and especially the last push in the last year with, policing, things like that. I've seen a lot of community. So I'm from the Twin Cities originally, Minneapolis, and so I've seen the community really come together. And I think a lot of people's opinions are starting to move more towards like, how can we work with our neighbors, and like, how do we all connect together, things like that. And I think that's really valuable, and I hope it continues. And I'd like to definitely see more of that. It's like, well, maybe I can't put myself in your shoes, but figuring out that empathy, things like that. And I think that's such a key thing to people getting behind, fighting climate change, things like that, is making sure that they understand how it's impacting their life and their loved ones and things like that. So,
yeah, I think one of the big challenges we face in terms of addressing climate change is that billions of people in the developing world want to have the same standard of living that we do. And we can't say, well, we got this way because we burned lots of coal and oil and natural gas, but we don't want you to do that. And that's, how do we handle equity in terms of developing nations versus developed nations?
Awesome. Yeah, Thanks, Chuck, and thanks you all. I feel like the discussion is just getting really interesting, but we've already gone 5 minutes over time, so I don't want to keep our audience too long. But I just wanted to remind everyone, those that are still with us, this event is hopefully something we'll be having more in the future, possibly with Chuck again, or maybe with other guests as well. Stay tuned for more. You can sign up for a newsletter on our website, www.ournd.org. And let's see, and you can also send questions to info@ournd.org. You all will be receiving an email with links and things that were discussed in this discussion following the event anyway, so keep a lookout for that. Finally, this event is really a celebration of a really big moment for R&D as an organization. Today we launched a $50,000 funding opportunity for research in sustainable aviation fuel, which is a huge deal. And there's been so many people involved with getting R&D to this point. So just congratulations to everyone really who was involved with that. This is big. And finally, I want to wish everybody a very happy Earth Day and another big thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.